In this editorial, we will discuss the situation of Sri Lanka and especially Mr. Gotabaya. Gotabaya, who has run away from Sri Lanka. That's why the title is Fleeing, Quitting. Flee means to run away from a place, and quit means to stop doing something or to leave a job or to leave a place. So finally, Mr. Gotabaya has resigned and he has run away from Sri Lanka. With Gotabaya quitting, after the resignation of Mr. Gotabaya, new leadership should heed people's aspirations in Sri Lanka. Heed means to pay attention. Aspiration means deep desires, ambitions. So finally, new leadership should pay attention to the ambitions of Sri Lankan. Sri Lanka's president Gotabaya Rajapakse has resigned at last. So finally he has resigned. But not before keeping the country guessing for 2 days. But before his resignation, the whole of Sri Lankan people were continuously guessing about his resignation. In a not unexpected and not double negative means positive. When you use double negative in a sentence, it becomes positive. In a not unexpected, so here it means it was expected turn of events. So finally what happened, and it was expected, the beleaguered means who has been surrounded. A person, if he has been surrounded, we will call that person a beleaguered person. So finally the beleaguered executive. If you are an executive, it means you belongs to government, you are from the decision making body, you are from the administrative side. The beleaguered executive head of Sri Lanka. Here again we are discussing Mr. Gotabaya, who was beleaguered, fled to run away by an Air Force plane. So by an Air Force plane he ran away from Sri Lanka. And where did he reach? Reached the Maldives. From Sri Lanka he reached Maldives and thereafter went to Singapore, and finally he went to Singapore. Presumably means we can guess on his way to another country. We can guess now he is again moving from Singapore to another country. Evidently, hedging. Evidently means there is a full proof, there are full proofs. Hedging against. Hedge means to protect oneself, a way of protecting oneself. Hedging against the possibility of being turned back. When you are turned back, it means you are shown the direction from where you have come. Of being turned back by any of these countries. So Mr. Gotabaya had fear that if he resigns the post of president, then he may be turned back by these countries. That's why he didn't resign unless he reached Maldives or unless he reached Singapore. Evidently hedging against the possibility of being turned back by any of these countries, he did not submit his resignation on July 13 as promised. It was promised by Mr. Gotabaya that he would resign on July 13, but he didn't submit his resignation on July 13. Until when? Until he didn't reach to Maldives or Singapore. As he sent in his resignation Thursday evening. So finally on Thursday evening he sent his resignation. It was clear, and after that, it was very obvious. He was holding out so that he would not lose his presidential immunity. Immunity means protection. So if you are president, then you have protection. If you are president of a country for the name only, then you have a lot of protection. That's why he was holding his post continuously. He would not lose his presidential immunity from prosecution. Prosecution means to bring a case against someone in a court of law until he reached safe haven. Safe haven means safe place. So Mr. Gotabaya was expecting that he should not resign until he reach to a good place. Given the widespread wrath, widespread means general, very general or universal. Wrath means anger against him. So there was, you can say, general anger against him in Sri Lanka. Being in Colombo without the shield means also cover, protection. Without the shield of office was not an option for him. So he was in a very difficult situation in Sri Lanka, and he could not live in Sri Lanka without the president post, as it was not a good option for him. Instead, he appointed Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe to discharge the president's function. To discharge the president's function means he handed over the functions of president to Ranil Wickremesinghe, and he appointed him in his absence using a provision. Provision means a rule in the constitution. So according to the constitution of Sri Lanka, he used a provision and finally appointed Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe to discharge the president's functions, which allows, here which is Sri Lankan constitution, which allows such an arrangement if the incumbent means one who is in power, incumbent has to leave the country or is otherwise unable to perform his duties. So Sri Lankan constitution says that president can appoint any person to discharge his duty if he cannot perform his duty if he cannot perform his duties due to any reason. Mr. Wickremesinghe is now unlikely. Likely means chances are there. Unlikely means chances are not there. Unlikely to respond to calls for his resignation. Mr. Wickremesinghe is now unlikely to respond to calls for his resignation. So chances are there that Mr. Vikram Singhe will not give a response about his resignation, about Mr. who he is Gotabaya's resignation. As the country's constitution provides, as Sri Lankan constitution says that the current prime minister shall act as president until is a time condition, until a new one is elected. So in these circumstances, according to Sri Lankan constitution, the current prime minister shall act as president, or current prime minister may act as president until a new one is elected. While the legislature means law making body, is to be convened. Convene means when you conduct a meeting. When you conduct a meeting, it is called convening of a meeting. So convene means to invite or to hold a meeting, while the legislature is to be convened. So this action is to be done while the legislature is to be convened soon for Formally here means for temporary purpose, electing a new president. So there would be a meeting, and in that meeting the whole members of legislature would be invited and a new president would be elected. There are questions over whether the mass, here mass means people, general people, uprise means revolt, rebellion, will abate. Abate means to reduce. So there are questions over whether the mass uprising will abate, whether the public revolution in Sri Lanka will reduce, as its protagonists means main leader, have been asking for Mr. Vikramasinghe's resignation too. So during these protests, we have seen the main leaders of protests have been continuously demanding for Mr. Vikramasinghe's resignation also. They want that Mr. Vikramasinghe should also resign, seeing him as equally discredited. Why public wants Vikramasinghe's resignation? Because public consider Mr. Vikramasinghe equally discredited. When you are considered discredited, it means you don't deserve that post, or you don't deserve that title that you are holding. So public want Vikramasinghe's resignation also. It is perhaps in anticipation. When you anticipate something, it means you expect something, you hope for something. Perhaps in anticipation of an intensification. Intensification means when a situation becomes more serious. Intensification of the protests, that Mr. Vikramasinghe has asked the military to do whatever is needed to restore. Restore means to bring back to normal, to restore order. So finally anticipating, finally expecting that this protest may get intensified. So Mr. Vikramasinghe has asked the military, or has given orders to military to do whatever is needed to restore order, to maintain law and order. Mr. Vikramasinghe has given permission to military. But order is not born of, bloodshed. But order is not born of. But this order is not born of. Born of means as a result of particular situation. Bloodshed. Bloodshed means killing, violence, extreme killing, extreme violence. It is called bloodshed. But order is not born of bloodshed. So this order has been given by Vikramasinghe, but this order didn't come due to bloodshed. Confrontation must be avoided. Confrontation means when you fight with someone, it is called confrontation. When two parties are fighting, it means they are confronting each other. Confrontation must be avoided. So the efforts should be to avoid confrontation, and efforts made to heed the demands of the people, and there should be efforts from the executive side to pay attention to the demands of the people. The world has been amazed. When you are amazed by something, it means you are surprised by the unprecedented. Unprecedented means something that has never happened before. It means it it has happened first time. The world has been amazed by the unprecedented display of righteous anger. Righteous means morally correct, anger and correct. So during this time period and during this whole of situation, the world was surprised that it happened first time in Sri Lanka. The display of righteous anger, है ना? Display means to show something. So people showed their morally correct anger, people showed their courage by the citizens of Sri Lanka. So the world was surprised by the courage of citizens of Sri Lanka. Why? As they channeled means to give a direction. As they channeled the widespread fury. Fury means again wrath. Fury means anger. Widespread means general. Because the people of Sri Lanka channeled their anger against the devastation. Devastation means destruction caused by the economic crisis. Crisis means a great trouble. So Sri Lanka was in great economic crisis, and Sri Lanka was completely destroyed due to the economic crisis. So there was a widespread anger among public, but public channelized this anger, economic crisis, on their day-to-day existence. So the daily life of Sri Lankans was getting affected seriously. As civil society came together, civil society, you can count the persons like journalists or some educated sections of a particular community or of a country. You can call them civil society, came together. It is apt means suitable, appropriate, to see this as a revolutionary moment in which, so here at present in Sri Lanka, you can call this situation a very appropriate revolutionary moment. Revolutionary means something that is revolution means rebel or revolt, rebellion. So it's a very great moment in which an avaricious means greedy, when you are full of greediness, avaricious, and apathetic, when you are apathetic means you are completely indifferent towards the feeling of others. Apathetic political class. So this revolt was against the apathetic political class. This revolt was against an avaricious political class. So it is apt to see this as a revolutionary movement in which an avaricious and apathetic political class has been humbled. Humble means to defeat someone decisively, to defeat someone completely. Humbled by people, united by suffering. Suffering means if you are suffering with something, it means you are in trouble due to that thing. So people of Sri Lanka were in trouble due to economic crisis, and finally they got united and defeated the apathetic and avaricious political class of Sri Lanka. While external observers see this as a moment of truth for authoritarian leaders. Authoritarian leaders means dictatorial leadership. Power hungry politicians who wants only power, and their ilk means type. So finally, while external observers see this as a moment of truth for authoritarian leaders, power hungry politicians and their ilk. So external observers है ना, like here external observers means international community. See, this is a very truthful moment for Sri Lankans, but it remains to be seen if political leaders in Sri Lanka themselves have drawn any lesson from it. Draw lesson. Draw lesson means to understand something from a situation. What did you learn from this situation? So now we have to see whether the political leaders of Sri Lanka have learned something from this situation. Reports suggest that joking for power, joking for power, when we say that you are trying, when you are joking for something, it means you are trying to get thing by any way, anyhow you are trying to get thing. So reports suggest that joking for power is going on. Going on means it is continuously happening, going on one side. So there are some reports that say that still the political, the leaders of Sri Lanka are trying to get power anyhow on one side, even as means at the same time. Images of protesters overwhelming offices. Overwhelm means be too much of something. It is called overwhelm. When you cover an entire area, it means you have overwhelmed that area. Images of protesters overwhelming offices and residences. So here we have seen some images, and in those images we can see the protesters have occupied the offices and residences of president associated with the rulers. So residences of those associated with the rulers are going viral. So these images are continuously being posted on social media, or anyhow these images are continuously going viral, and in these images we can see clearly that the people of Sri Lanka have overwhelmed offices and residences associated with the rulers. Sri Lankans may expect that a change of regime means system, will mean a new order. So now Sri Lankans can expect that after the change of the current system, new order means new order that would usher in. Usher in means to bring in, to include, usher in constitutional changes. So when new regime would take place, and that new regime would include some constitutional changes. Policy reform. When you reform something, it means you improve that thing, you make some corrections in it. Policy reforms and reverse the trend of public interest being sacrificed for political end. Political end means your personal political benefits. So what is being happening in Sri Lanka is that the political class of Sri Lanka is continuously taking the advantage, is continuously exploiting the people of Sri Lanka, and continuously they are working for their political interests, and they are exploiting the people of Sri Lanka. So Sri Lankans now can expect that according to new policy reforms, this trend will reverse and public interest would be given preference. The next president should recognize this legitimate means lawful, correct, aspiration means desires, and refrain. Refrain means to avoid something. Refrain from any attempt to maintain the status quo. Status quo means existing situation. So finally, editorial says the next president should understand that this is legitimate aspiration of Sri Lankans, that public interest should be given preference. So new president avoid should avoid from doing should avoid to maintain the status quo. It means the status quo must be changed. The existing situation must be changed. The new president should not try to the cover up means to hide, cover up the misdeed. Misdeed means your bad acts, your bad works, misdeeds that led means the cause of something that led the country to the current crisis. So the next president should not try to hide the misdeeds that were the cause for Sri Lankan people, and that were the cause for the current crisis, for the current troubled situation. Or and neither the next president should preserve. When you preserve something, it means you maintain that thing, you protect that thing. It is called preserving. And neither the next president should preserve the ill gotten. Ill gotten means something that has been obtained dishonestly. It is called ill gotten. Gain means advantage, profits of office. Neither should the next president try to preserve the dishonestly obtained benefits of office. It means there are some political leaders, and these political leaders have gained some political advantage, or they have got some dishonest, they have obtained something politically, some dishonest thing, so it should be completely avoided.